The house was everything I had hoped for. After months of renovations, selecting the perfect paint colors, searching for the ideal furniture, and agonizing over every little detail, it finally felt complete. It was no longer just a house, it was our home. I had dedicated so much time and energy to it, investing not just money but my heart and soul. This house wasn't simply a place to live. It was a reflection of what I believed my marriage to Daniel could be, a partnership, a fresh start, a space where we could create something beautiful together. So, when he casually announced at dinner that Greg would be staying with us for a while, it hit me like a slap. "Greg's going to stay with us for a bit," Daniel said, spearing a piece of chicken. "He's just trying to get back on his feet." I stared at him, stunned, unsure if I had heard correctly. "Greg? Your friend? The one who's going through a divorce?" I asked. "Yeah," Daniel replied nonchalantly, chewing his food. "He needs a place to crash, and he's bringing his dog too." I set my fork down, my appetite instantly gone. "How long is a while?" I asked, trying to mask the irritation building inside me. Daniel shrugged, uninterested. "Until further notice." I was Julia, 36 years old, and for the past year, I had put my heart into making this house our home. It was never just about renovations. It was about crafting a sanctuary where Daniel and I could settle into the next chapter of our lives. But over time, I had begun to notice an unsettling pattern. Daniel often made big decisions without consulting me. Whether it was changing jobs, planning trips, or, as it turned out, inviting his recently divorced best friend to live with us indefinitely, my opinion always seemed like an afterthought. Whenever I voiced my concerns, Daniel would dismiss them with a casual, "It's fine," or "We'll figure it out." Each time I let it go, convincing myself it wasn't worth the argument. But this time it felt different. The house had been supposed to be our space, the one place where I thought I would finally have a voice in our decisions. And yet, here we were, with Daniel once again making unilateral choices that disrupted our lives. "Daniel," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "don't you think we should have talked about this first? This is a huge decision." He looked at me as if I had suggested something ridiculous. "Why? It's my house too. I don't need your permission to help my best friend." My stomach tightened. This isn't just about Greg. We've only just moved in and are finally starting to settle down, and now you're inviting someone else to live with us for an unknown period of time? What about his dog? What about our space? This affects both of us. Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, it's not a big deal. Greg's going through a rough patch, and I'm not going to abandon him. He's my best friend. You'd do the same for one of your friends." "That's not the point," I said, my voice growing sharper. "The point is you didn't ask me. You just made a decision, and now I'm supposed to accept it without question." "It's my house too, Julia," he snapped, his tone turning defensive. "And my decision is final." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. My decision is final. Not our decision. His. It was clear in that moment. He didn't see me as an equal partner. He saw me as someone who would adjust, compromise, and follow his lead, no matter what. And the worst part was, he expected me to accept it without putting up a fight. I stared at him across the table, my heart racing, every part of me screaming to yell, to tell him how wrong he was. But instead, I took a deep breath. I had learned over the years that arguing with Daniel rarely led anywhere. He would dig in, turn the blame on me, and the cycle would continue. So I did something I had never done before. I stayed silent. "Okay," I said finally, my voice calm but icy. "If that's how you feel." Daniel frowned, clearly expecting a bigger reaction. "That's it?" I nodded. "That's it." I cleared the table without another word, retreating to the bedroom while Daniel sat back down and turned on the TV. As I loaded the dishwasher, my hands trembled, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He thought he had won. He thought I would let it go, just like I always had. But this time, he was wrong. That night, as Daniel slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house I had worked so hard to build no longer felt like mine. It had become a backdrop for someone else's decisions, a place where I had no say. And if I didn't stand up for myself now, it would only get worse. A plan began to form in my mind. At first, it was a small idea, but with every passing moment, it grew stronger. I wasn't going to yell or beg or try to change his mind. I was going to show Daniel what it meant to make a decision without considering anyone else. When he showed up with Greg and that dog, they would see just how final my decisions could be. Over the next few days, I quietly began setting my plan into motion. Daniel had no idea. Why would he? He had made it clear that he saw his word as law, and as always, he assumed I would fall in line. This time, however, I wasn't about to back down. I had invested so much time, energy, and effort into making this house a home, and I wasn't going to let it become someone else's temporary lodging without a word. The first thing I took care of was the locks. While Daniel was at work, I called a locksmith and explained that I wanted all the exterior locks replaced. I told him it was just a precaution, putting on a polite smile as he worked. He didn't need to know the full story, and honestly, I wasn't ready to admit to anyone what had finally driven me to this point. Once the job was complete, I held the new keys in my hands, feeling a small sense of control I hadn't experienced in months. Next, I focused on reclaiming the space inside. I walked through the house, taking stock of everything that bore Daniel's influence. The oversized recliner he had insisted on keeping, the unattractive coffee table his mother had gifted us, the tacky sports memorabilia covering the walls, all of it went straight into the garage. When I was finished, the house felt different. Lighter. It felt like mine again. That evening, Lauren came over to help me finalize my plan. She had been my best friend since college, the one person who had always told me the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. "So, you're really going through with this?" she asked, lounging on the newly cleared couch. "Absolutely," I replied, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "He wants to make all the decisions by himself? Fine. Let's see how he feels when I start making my own decisions too." Lauren grinned and raised her glass. "I love this for you. But seriously, what's your endgame? What are you going to do when he shows up with Greg and the dog?" I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment before answering. "I'll let them know this is still my house. They can either respect my boundaries or come up with their own plan. I'm done bending over backwards for Daniel's nonsense." The next step was preparing for their arrival. I had no intention of turning Greg away completely. It wasn't his fault that Daniel had overstepped. But I wasn't about to roll out the red carpet for him either. I set up the guest room with only the bare necessities, a mattress, a single pillow, and an old blanket. No extra comforts. No room for the dog. Nothing that invited anyone to settle in comfortably. If Daniel wanted to play the gracious host, he could do so without my help. In the meantime, I packed a small bag of Daniel's belongings, just the essentials, and left it by the front door. It wasn't a threat, not really. It was more of a reminder that this was my home too, and I wouldn't hesitate to defend it if he continued ignoring my voice. The real kicker was the letter. I spent hours carefully drafting it, ensuring every word conveyed exactly what I wanted. It wasn't a fiery rant. That wasn't my style. Instead, it was calm, clear, and firm, outlining how I felt and what I expected moving forward. "Daniel," it began. "This house is our shared home, which means decisions regarding it should be made together. By inviting Greg to live here without consulting me first, you dismissed my feelings and undermined our partnership. I won't tolerate being treated as an afterthought in my own home. If Greg stays here, it will be on my terms, not yours. And if you can't respect that, you're free to leave." I printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and taped it to the front door. It would be the first thing Daniel and Greg saw when they arrived. The days leading up to their arrival were strangely quiet. Daniel mentioned Greg a few times, casually referring to the arrangements he had made, but he never pressed me for my opinion. I was fine with that. I kept my responses short and polite, carefully hiding my growing anticipation behind a calm exterior. Lauren checked in every day, half amused and half excited. "I wish I could see their faces when they read that letter," she said during one of our calls. "Do you think Daniel will even understand what he did wrong?" I sighed, running my fingers over the new keys in my pocket. "Honestly, probably not. But that's not the point. This isn't about him understanding. It's about me standing up for myself. Finally, the day came. Daniel had sent me a text that morning, saying they'd be at the house around 6 in the evening. Make sure everything's ready for Greg, he wrote, as if I were a hotel staff member. I rolled my eyes and made the final touches to my plan. The house was spotless, the guest room was as basic as could be, and the letter was firmly taped to the door. A mix of nerves and anticipation stirred inside me as the clock ticked toward 6. For years, I had let Daniel's behavior slide, telling myself it wasn't worth fighting over. But now, I was ready. When I heard the car pull into the driveway, my heart raced. I stayed near the kitchen, out of sight but close enough to hear everything. I didn't need to see their faces to know the exact moment they read the letter. Daniel's voice rang out clearly. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. "It looks like a letter," Greg replied, his voice quieter. "Maybe you should read it." The days leading up to their arrival were strangely quiet. Daniel mentioned Greg a few times, casually referring to the arrangements he had made, but he never pressed me for my opinion. I was fine with that. I kept my responses short and polite, carefully hiding my growing anticipation behind a calm exterior. Lauren checked in every day, half amused and half excited. I took a deep breath, feeling the silence settle over the house as my words began to linger in the air. What on earth is going on? Daniel's voice suddenly shattered the stillness, his anger echoing throughout the house as the front door slammed shut. I remained in the kitchen, allowing the tension to build. I wanted him to fully absorb the letter, to think about the meaning behind it, before I made my presence known. "What's happening here?" Greg's voice followed, quieter, but filled with a sense of unease. "Should I leave?" "I don't want to make things worse." "Oh, you're not leaving." Daniel's angry reply cut through the air, his voice rising. "This is my house too, and no one gets to make decisions without me." At that moment, I walked into the room, calm and composed, as though nothing unusual had just transpired. "Oh, hi, Daniel." "Hi, Greg," I said with an almost casual tone. It was enough to throw both men off for a moment. "I see you found the letter." Daniel spun around to face me, the crumpled paper still in his hand. "What's this?" he demanded, waving the letter at me. "What are you trying to do?" "I'm not trying to do anything," I responded, folding my arms. "I'm just reminding you that this is our home. I won't stand by while you treat me like an outsider in a space that's supposed to be ours." Greg, visibly uncomfortable, took a small step back. "Hey, Julia, if this is a bad time, I can." "No, Greg," I interrupted gently, trying to ease the situation. "This isn't your fault. You're just caught in the middle of something Daniel should have handled differently." "Handled differently?" Daniel snapped, his face flushing with anger. "You're the one handling this poorly. Changing locks? Rearranging the house? What exactly are you doing?" "I'm making a point," I replied firmly. "For years, you've made decisions without involving me. This house was supposed to be a fresh start for us, Daniel. But instead, you've turned it into a place for everyone else's problems. And when I asked for a conversation, you told me your decision was final." "Because it is," he shot back, his voice hardening. "Greg's my best friend. He needed somewhere to stay, and I'm not going to apologize for helping him. And I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself," I countered, my voice calm but firm. "If Greg stays here, it will be on my terms, not yours." Greg raised his hands in a pacifying gesture. "Guys, look, maybe this isn't the best time for me to move in. I don't want to be the cause of any conflict between you two." Daniel turned on him, his frustration boiling over. "No, Greg, you're staying. Julia's just overreacting. She'll get over it." "I won't," I replied flatly, causing both men to pause. "This isn't something I'll simply get over. You've ignored me, dismissed me, and taken me for granted for far too long, Daniel. This time, I'm drawing the line." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, gesturing toward the guest room. "So what? You're going to keep me out of my own house? Good luck with that." I stepped forward, meeting his gaze directly. "It's not just your house, Daniel. It's mine too. And unless you start treating me as an equal partner, maybe you should be the one leaving." The room fell into a heavy silence. Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could be anywhere but here. Daniel stared at me, his disbelief evident. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "You're serious," he said quietly. "I've never been more serious," I answered firmly. "You've taken me for granted for far too long, Daniel. If you want this relationship to work, you're going to have to start listening to me. If not, I'll be fine on my own." Greg cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Julia," he said cautiously, "I think I should leave. This isn't my fight." "You're right," I said, turning to face him. "It's not. And I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this. But this is about setting boundaries. I hope you understand." Greg nodded, grabbing his bag and the dog's leash. "I'll figure something out," he said, giving Daniel a meaningful glance. "Take care of this, man. Seriously." As Greg exited, Daniel and I were left alone in the entryway, the tension between us thick and palpable. "This is ridiculous," Daniel muttered, pacing back and forth. "All of this over Greg staying here for a little while." "It's not just about Greg," I said softly, my voice gentler now. "It's about how you treat me. You didn't consult me. You didn't think about my feelings. You assumed I'd just go along with whatever you decided. That's not how a partnership works, Daniel." He stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he admitted begrudgingly. "I thought you'd understand." "Well, I didn't," I replied, standing my ground. "And if we're going to move forward, things need to change. No more decisions made without me. No more dismissing me. I'm your wife, not a tenant in your house." For a long time, Daniel didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the letter still crumpled in his hand. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "I get it. Do you?" I asked, my tone skeptical. He gazed up at me, his face weary yet genuine. "I do. I don't want to lose you, Julia," he said softly. I nodded slowly, replying, "Then start acting like it." Once Greg left, the house felt unnervingly silent. The absence of his dog, the bag he'd taken with him, and the lingering awkwardness of our final exchange seemed to hang in the air. Daniel sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, as if the weight of everything from the night was finally settling on him. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was the one who had to fix things. I busied myself in the kitchen, putting away glasses and tidying up. Mostly, I needed the space to clear my mind. What came next was uncertain, but I knew I had spoken my truth. How Daniel responded was something he needed to work through. It wasn't my responsibility to carry that burden for him. After a few moments, I heard his footsteps approaching slowly, deliberately. "Julia," his voice was gentler than I expected. "I need to talk." I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "I'm listening." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "About Greg. And about the way I've treated you. I've been selfish. I didn't consider how this would affect you." I paused, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to believe him, but I had heard apologies before. "Do you understand why I'm upset?" I asked carefully. "I think so," he replied, brow furrowed. "It's not just about Greg moving in. It's about how I handled it. How I didn't handle it with you. I made it seem like your opinion didn't matter. And that's not okay." I nodded. "No, it's not." He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I've always been the type to make decisions quickly. I didn't realize how much that was hurting us." I stood firm, but my voice remained gentle. "You've had years to realize it. And I've had years of being dismissed and overlooked. That stops now, Daniel. If you can't change, if we can't truly be partners, I won't stay." He tightened at my words, but didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. "You're right. I don't want to lose you, Julia. I know I've messed up, but I want to do better." That night, we slept in separate rooms, not out of anger, but because I needed time to process what had just happened. For years, I had carried the weight of Daniel's decisions, sacrificing my voice and comfort for the sake of our marriage. Standing up for myself felt empowering, but it also left me wondering if anything would actually change. I replayed the events of the evening, Greg's quiet departure, Daniel's emotional outburst, and his eventual attempt at taking responsibility. Was he being genuine? Could he really change after all this time? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going back to how things were. Over the next few days, Daniel made a noticeable effort. He began to ask for my opinion on decisions, small ones, like where to go for dinner, and bigger ones, like how to divide responsibilities around the house. It wasn't perfect, and I could tell it wasn't easy for him, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like we might actually be partners. As for me, I started focusing on what made me happy. I redecorated parts of the house to reflect my own tastes, adding personal touches that made the space feel like mine again. I also spent more time with Lauren, catching up over coffee and laughing about the chaos of the past few weeks. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, stronger, more confident, and less willing to settle for anything less than what I deserved. A month later, the house felt like a completely different place. It wasn't because of the decor or layout, but because of the overall atmosphere. It was quieter, more balanced, and for the first time in years, it finally felt like my home. I had spent weeks reclaiming not just my physical space, but my emotional one too. And that effort had paid off. Daniel had taken the confrontation seriously. He started therapy, not because I'd asked him to, but because he realized his behavior needed to change. One evening over dinner, he admitted that he hadn't understood how much his decisions had pushed me away, how his assumption that we'd figure it out had really meant, "You'll adjust." "I didn't respect you the way I should have," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I thought I was being a good husband by handling things on my own, but I see now that I was just shutting you out." It wasn't easy to hear him say those things. A part of me wanted to scream, "Why did it take this long?" But I also knew that change wasn't instantaneous. For the first time in our marriage, Daniel was putting in the effort, and I appreciated that. It didn't erase the years of frustration, but it was a step forward. As for me, I had finally found my voice again. The version of me that had been buried under years of compromise and silence was coming back to life. I set clear, firm, and unapologetic boundaries, and Daniel respected them. In summary, the house transformed, not due to physical changes, but because of the renewed energy. I reclaimed my space both emotionally and physically, and that shift made all the difference. Daniel recognized his mistakes, and for the first time in a long while, he was truly trying. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and I felt stronger and more confident in my own right. When he suggested having Greg over for dinner one weekend, I appreciated how he framed it as a question rather than an expectation. I told him dinner sounded good, but just dinner, no sleepover, and Greg should leave the dog at home. He gave a nod of agreement. "Of course, thank you for agreeing," he said. It seemed like a small gesture, but to me, it felt like a small victory. Lauren noticed the shift too. One morning, while we were having coffee, she leaned back in her chair with a smile. "You look lighter," she remarked, happier. I nodded, admitting I feel lighter. For the first time in a long time, I'm not walking on eggshells around him. I know exactly what I want, and I'm not afraid to speak up anymore. Raising her cup, she toasted, to finally taking up space. To not settling for less, I responded, clinking my cup against hers. There were still moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether this would last or whether Daniel's efforts would continue, but there was one thing I was certain of. I would never lose myself in a relationship again. The woman who stood at the kitchen counter, calmly giving an ultimatum to her husband, wasn't going anywhere.